We're here to talk jigging in Puget Sound. I don't know if anybody recognizes this old timer right here. He's been around for a couple years. He loves to fish steelhead, but if you talk to him as of late, you know what? He gets pretty geeked out about the opportunity to get on my boat, go out to Puget Sound and jig for Chinook in Area 13 or anywhere throughout Puget Sound. Now, what I'm going to talk about today, jigging Area 13 specifically, because it's open 365 days a year. It's a 2-rod endorsement. Your limit is 2 fish. Now, is there a ton of fish down there? At times, you know. I had a few folks come to my booth today and say, hey, you're going to talk about Area 13? You know, I'm like, yeah, pull up a map. Area 13 is a huge area. If you're here to get, you know, waypoints and pin drops and all those cool things, exactly where I'm pulling fish off of the ground, you're at the wrong seminar. What we are going to cover is technique points and some of the things I like to do to find success. There's more than one way to jig for Chinook. There's a lot of options out there. This is kind of the refined program that I've been doing of finding success, and I felt it was worth sharing because if we're finding success, why not share that, right? This is applicable in areas 11, area 9 and 10. You find the fish, you can jig on the fish. The key is staying on top of the fish, and hopefully they're feeding, and you entice them with a jig in their face, and they're going to respond. Trolling for salmon is a lot of fun as well. Okay, if I state your ages, they're in their mid-80s. They have a 12-foot Livingston. They launch it. They go fish American Lake for kokanee and trout. Mom outfishes dad 90% of the time. They have a great time. I hope to be in my mid-80s still launching my small boat and getting out on the water and fishing, right? We all agree? Get them out in the boat 2 seasons ago, which was a pink year, once again. Lots of fish in Puget Sound. Mom lands her first Chinook ever. She's 4'11", 5 foot with the fro, is what we like to say. She's using a rod that's 10.5 feet long, okay? I'm like, Mom, the rod you're fishing with is twice the length of your height, right? She lands about a 12-pound hatchery Chinook. That was in that moment of time through that season where, oh, you can keep hatchery Chinook. No, we're closing it for a week. Oh, you can keep them for 3 days. No, we're closing it for 2 weeks. And unfortunately, they were on the boat that day where we had to release the Chinook. But we got 30 fish that morning, a few Chinook, coho, and pinks, trolling. Trolling is a great way to find fish. It's a lot of fun. I love having people on the boat when we're trolling, cover a lot of ground, sunshine, Puget Sound. Who doesn't want to do that? Get some nice fish, go home, successful day. It's a lot of fun. The one thing it's missing is actually holding that fishing rod in your hand at the moment the fish engages with that. And the whole hook set, instant gratification, feeling the whole thing. It's like my seminar the other day, drift fishing. Back in the day, drift fishing, even for Chinook, on some of our favorite rivers with a rag yarn that you tie up at home and a glob of eggs and just bouncing that in a hole. And at the pause when the Chinook starts chewing, and you can feel the sensation of a Chinook chewing on that fishing rod, and you're just waiting till it really starts loading up and you decide when you're going to set that hook. There's a whole, like, I'm in tune with this thing, right? And it feels really good to feel that sensation of a fish picking it up on the drift. We lose that when we use bobbers and floats and things. Sure, who doesn't want to watch the float go down? You have since you were a kid perch fishing, or crappie, for you crappie fishermen and ladies in the audience. I know there's a few. You still love watching that float bury with a big Chinook crushing your eggs and just taking it on a run. Trolling for salmon is a lot of fun. Jigging for salmon puts that rod back in your hand. It's like that drift fish experience, right? And that first time that fish slams that jig on the drop, you go, what the hell just happened? See, jigging is about finesse and how that jig flutters and falls in their face. Coho do the same thing in the rivers. Chinook do the same thing in the rivers. Why do you think twitching is so popular and works so well? Different process, different approach, different types of gear. But we're twitching that jig. And when do those salmon 90% of the time hit that jig? On the drop. And it will surprise you because there's a moment of time where there's slack in your system. You lose a sense of feel if you're doing it right because you want that natural free fall. If you're holding back at all and that thing is just kind of hanging there suspended, not truly dropping. Who's ever been twitching for coho? You cast across river into a small pocket that you go, there's got to be a fish laying in there. And before you even hammer out your first twitch, that coho grabs that thing on the drop. People think in clear water, coho are stacked up in there, and as soon as that jig hits the water, the fish take off. That jig hits the water, is anything different than a branch falling in the water, a leaf, something, dropping from the sky? That jig will hit the water and drop, and then coho will slam that thing first cast, so you better be ready. It's very much like taking a rod in Puget Sound and we're jigging, right? So I want to cover, like, why am I using this rod? Does scent matter? These types of jigs, what's the deal, and who's this old guy? This is a successful day, got into a handful of fish. Look at that water. That's what I want. No wind, beautiful morning on Puget Sound, sun's coming up. Check your tides, and we're going to talk about all that stuff. So really what I got here is, we're heading out during sunrise. Here's the rods and reel we'll talk about. Here's a successful day. Look at all this activity on the electronics that we're going to talk about. Actually see your jig working in the water column, watching the fish crushing bait. If that doesn't get you excited when you look at your electronics, you didn't give up fishing, because that's what it's all about. That's the best video game ever created right there. So rods and reels. So I'm not saying you have to run out and buy these higher end expensive rods, or for me, it's about becoming an old man with a bad shoulder, and I like a 6.5 foot rod. Now I will tell you, when you hook into a mid-teen or a 20-pound Chinook on this 6.5 foot rod, one piece, this is a slow pitch rod designed for fishing lingcod and tuna and things like that in the ocean. I decided I was going to start pitching jigs with this for Chinook. I'm like, if it can handle a lingcod and a tuna, we can certainly handle a Chinook. The biggest complication on this is when those Chinook take off and go under the boat. You almost don't have enough rod to get out far enough to keep the line from rubbing on the bottom of your boat. So it's a bit of a challenge there. And of course, when a sea line grabs your salmon, all bets are off. You're going to lose your jig. So this is a 661. It's made by Edge. It's a 20 to 40 pound rod. Now look at the diameter of that rod. Okay. Now this has an operation area from about to here to here. If I'm fighting a fish and I think I'm going to bring it back up to here, like I would with a 9 foot rod, 10.5 foot rod, something like that. If I'm really going to like get into that fish and go this way, you're going to break this rod. So it's all about the comfort of this thing. When I'm fighting a fish, it's right underneath my arm like that. It's a leverage. It's a lever, right? It's reeling down and coming up to about eye level. Reeling down, coming up to eye level. If I'm going here, you potentially break these rods. Now again, I'm not saying you need to use this style of rod. For me, 8.5 foot rod, 9 foot rod, jigging all day, your arm, your shoulder, you're going to get worn out. If you're jigging multiple days in a row, it starts wearing on you. Elbows, forearm, things like that. You wouldn't think so, but you do anything repetitive that you have not been working out or doing anything, like me, lazy for a couple of years, it starts wearing on you, okay? So I opted to start using this 6.5 foot rod, and I can jig for days on end with this thing. It's so light. And again, it's a jig up and a natural fall down. When we're jigging, you can exceed that point of where we want to keep it when we're fighting a fish. Don't let me confuse you with that, but so I want a lot of action on the jig. The biggest key, and we'll talk a little more about this, is that natural free fall. Jig it up, drop the rod, let the line drop. Jig it up, drop the rod, let the line drop, right? So for me, it's comfortable. Lever action reel, real simple to use. Now, can you use a bait caster? Absolutely. Can I use an 8 foot spinning rod? Absolutely. If you want to jig with a spinning rod, now orientation, that reel hanging down there all day, the wrist starts getting a little tired. If any of you guys are using spinning rods for jigging, you're going to know that you start feeling that after a while. This one here, it's all about the lever and the ability for me to tuck it into my body, and I'm using my body to like fight that 20-something pound fish, right? So it's an option. It's not a have to. And then the reel is, it's an ocean reel, nice big winch handle on here. But again, spinning rods, absolutely. Because at times you may want to cast those jigs and have a really long fall pendulum swing into an area, especially when the humpies are running, okay?
What's your line weight?
That is 30-pound braid, and I put on a 25-pound top shot of about 10 to 12 feet. So, yeah, good question. Thank you. Jigs. So there's a lot of different Options. Now, for the last several years, I connected with father and son, Jason and Tyler, father and son fishing, and they took over from old man Otto, who passed, unfortunately, a few years ago, the Grim Reefer. Okay, the Grim Reefer. It's a 3.5 ounce jig, and they put on the Hypervis tape, which has really great visual abilities at depth. And what I'm showing you here is different ways to rig. So like if you buy a jig, you're going to put the barrel swivel on, the snap ring in, the sickle hook. Okay, and I believe they've switched out even to using the Gamakatsu hooks. I put all Gamakatsu hooks on these 3/0. If you want to run a single hook, great. If you want to rig it more like a tuna jig, nothing wrong with that. I've caught a lot of fish on the jigs that I've orientated like that, and it does not typically get hung up. It's not an issue. Before I even went with those, I was rigging some of them at home just with mono. Same thing. Now that color right there, that is anchovy, very productive in Puget Sound. This is herring aid. Who's running a herring aid spoon or a herring aid flasher out in Puget Sound? For good reason, they work, right? Even the small hoochies, the ace high flies and your hoochies and your minis on your ace high flies, they all work, and that herring aid is just fantastic. Herring aid for your jigs work as well. Some of them have glow. I don't know if you guys see that. Some of these I put a slight bend in them. This is just a lead jig. So a slight bend totally changes the way that jig flutters on the down. Okay, so I've been using the 3.5s. It's plenty of weight to get down, but you got to understand what you're doing with boat operation, currents and tides and wind. And we're going to get into all that. Do I put scent on the jigs? Absolutely. Is there any downside to putting something as good as the Potskey's Fire Jill herring scent on my jig? Absolutely no downside. My buddy Matt Messing, who's been running charter for years, last year before, we're out fishing blackmouth, we're running spoons on the troll. I'm putting herring and anise on my 3.5 or my number 4 Kingfisher spoons. Okay, my herring aid spoon or my cop car, whatever I'm running. He's running his naked, nothing on it. About 8 fish into it, he's like, give me some of that crap. What is that? He puts it on his spoon. He's dropping his downrigger. Before he even gets to depth, it comes out of the clip. And he gets about an 8-pound blackmouth. And he goes, are you going to leave that on my boat? I said, sure, I'll leave it on your boat. Converted him that day. It's always amazing when you convert somebody, isn't it? So he now, for good reason, puts scent on his spoons, on his hoochies. Put a little swipe on your flasher if you're not afraid of just having to wash them up afterwards. Salmon are so olfactory driven, and on certain days out there in areas of Puget Sound, there are a lot of boats. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of electronics in the water, there's a lot of downrigger balls going through the water, there's a lot of things that have fish moving around. If I can do anything to entice them even just one little bit more to my lure presentation, I'm going to do it. And simply by putting a little bit of scent on your lure presentation can be a game changer. And I advocate, I've been with Potskey's forever. They came out with the fire gel. The Atlas mics, oils and things work okay too, but they don't last as long because it's more of a liquid. This has a really thick viscosity, much like a Vaseline. Once you put it on there, it's good for most of the day. You don't really have to re-scent. Works really well. So think about putting a little dab at the tail end of your jig if you're going to scent at all. Any questions? Single hook, dual hook, and then slider. Some guys like to fish a slider. It's a double hook. You bend the eyelets on each side of your jig and run your monofilament leader through there. Put a stopper bead against your double hook like a moochin rig. And now I'm just simply clipping this to the end of my, ouch, hooks are sharp. Clipping that to the end of my barrel swivel, and I can fish that way as well. Slider rig imparts a little bit different action, has the freedom of going up and down the leader. Some guys, that's the only way they'll fish jigs. Me, I'm kind of on the fence. It's like, seems to work just fine when I simply take a jig and hook it right to my snap. But there are different ways to orient the hooks and different options. Any questions on any of that?
I do have a question. Off your main line, do you use a snap swivel or just one of those half clip things without the swivel on the jig?
Fish on.
That's the way I do it.
Yeah. So you want something that spins and rolls, is durable. It's the dual lock. You know, it's the heavier duty. You definitely don't want that thing coming open. It's not just a simple little barrel swivel. You know, it's a higher end barrel swivel with a dual lock on there that's much more suitable for this type. You don't want them coming unsnapped, and you definitely don't want them coming unsnapped, you know, if you got a fish on. So pretty simple. Again, a little top shot of mono on there and you're good to go. The braid's nice because direct connect, no stretch. Jig drops down. When you go to pull it back up, you don't have a lot of slack in the system. It's like right now, raises your jig back up. So talked about various, jigs and color patterns, and they have a ton of them. Little herringbone with some glow. I don't know if you guys saw the show recently where I was demonstrating the glow tube and how well that works and lighten up your jigs and your spoons and your flashers and all that. But I will drop these jigs into that glow tube early morning and even on cloudy days and stuff, because we're dropping it down into water where there's less light. And so anything I can enhance, albeit glow and or scent, I'm just up in my game, right? Again, no downside. So let's talk electronics and what we're seeing on our sonar. So if I pull into an area and I have all this going on, I'm like, oh yeah. I want you to take note of the depth. Here we're 47, here we're 59, here we're going down the slope, we're 89 feet, but 58, 47, I literally do a lot of the jigging in the Area 13 in around certain points that are 40 to 80 feet. Get a lot of fish 40 to 50 feet down. They're not very deep. And if you find the bait, you find the fish. Right here we got a great example of a lot of candlefish coming up out of the sand. And look at what that Chinook's doing. They're just raking on through there, right? They're just scooping down. They're just up and down. That's a good amount of fish swimming around that area. So now that I found them, I like to sometimes throw a waypoint on my electronics and try to keep on top of them. Because the key to successful jigging is finding the fish and staying on top of them. They do move around. And we'll talk tides in a little bit, but here you can actually see the jig bouncing up and down, right in the school of fish. Here we're going down the slope, jigging. That is my jig on the electronics getting picked up on the sonar. Those fish are moving all up and down, swimming all over, crushing bait, and hitting those jigs.
Notice your temperature's all about 50.
Yep. Puget Sound's pretty consistent year round, even in the summertime. You know, surface temps will change a little bit. Well, once you get to depth, you're mid-50s pretty consistently in Puget Sound, no matter where you go. It doesn't change a whole lot. So, if you've ever gone swimming, I used to do. When I was fire department and we were doing water rescue and having drills out there in Puget Sound, it was not exactly fun. I didn't care if it was 90 degrees and I was in a dry suit. It was still cold, right? So, yeah, pretty consistent in the temperature. Really when it comes down to jigging, your key factors, and we're going to get into this here, is tide and wind. Wind is the worst. Wind almost at times will make it impossible to jig. So you're back to trolling, right? If you're jigging for Chinook, of course you have your troll rods on the boat because there's certain times throughout the tide and throughout the day where trolling is going to be to your benefit. Sometimes we start off trolling because we don't know where the fish are. Now we're covering ground looking for fish. And when I am trolling and all of a sudden I get into this situation and I'm in 50 or 40 foot of water as we're cruising along, it's like, look at that pile of fish. Boom, waypoint, pull the gear up, let's go. Stow everything, grab the jig rods, turn back around, grid pattern search till I find out, get on top of that waypoint. Got to enlarge your screen out so that you're like getting close to it. Start looking at your sonar and go, where are those fish at, right? And if there's a lot of bait in the area, they're probably going to kind of stay around there. And it also depends on what's happening with the tide. So big tides move bait and can stack it up, and that is true. Like you get a lot of current moving through. Like you got to think of Puget Sound as a giant river, and anywhere that Puget Sound narrows down between islands and land masses, you typically have a faster current speed. Agreed? Because you're pushing all that water through a narrow area. Once it widens out, you'll see that it slows down. There's areas in Area 13 where you can have the tide moving and you can see debris stuff floating on along, but you're tucked inside on some of the land masses and stuff, and you have hardly any current. We've literally jigged in 35 feet of water, and I didn't start jigging until I'm just cruising around with my electronics in that very calm water, and all of a sudden I find a pile of fish, 35 feet of water. Stay on top of them, drop a jig down, and you get a biter. So you're kind of hunting and pecking, looking for fish. Big tides will move bait. Can I jig if I got a lot of water moving on a big tide? Yes, because it's all about controlling the boat, but also what's the wind doing. If I have a big tide and little to no wind, I'm like, okay, we can make this happen. It's all about boat control. Would I choose to have a little softer tide? I really like things that are in that 6 and 7 foot exchange, right? If we're any time in between tides and it's a 6 to 7 foot exchange, that's like really comfortable. And look at the projection. We got a lot of fish moving. You know, what's happening right here? Here we're bottomed out on low tide. Now you've often heard it and say it 2 hours before high, 2 hours before low, 2 hours after. The key there is water starts moving again. And this is a little thing I picked up on as well. What's weird about the tide is when you're out jigging, at times you catch a lot of flounder. Okay? So you're jigging, you're catching a lot of flounder. You get to that point in the tide, and I don't care if it's high slack, low slack, the flounder stop biting. The flounder stop biting, you're kind of like, well, we got to wait it out, or we can go troll and just kind of see if we can't pick one up in the slack on the troll, because at times you can if there's a lot of fish around. And then you kind of look at what the tide's doing, and guess what? We kind of pull into this area where we're maybe an hour into the incoming tide, and that tells me, hey, we got water moving again. Go back to jigging. Oh, guess what? The flounder are biting. The flounder start biting, guess what? Nature's telling you it's time to start feeding. The salmon start biting. And you may think I'm full of crap, but it's happened out there multiple times. It's like we're not catching anything, the flounder aren't even biting. An hour later, all of a sudden, oh, flounder. Okay, find some Chinook, guess what? They're feeding. It's all tide driven, that's all they know. And they know that tide pushes bait around, and when bait gets pushed into certain areas because of currents and, you know, that magic river, those Chinook know where to be and navigate through, and they go look at cover and they find fish and they find feed. So boat operator is the key to maintain a vertical line. So when I'm jigging and running my boat, and I'm fortunate I got that Allied out there with that rear steering helm, and I can engage my motor or put it in neutral or whatever, you're going to find that your boat activity and control is a lot more involved if you have wind pushing you around. Current's no big deal because the boat's on the surface and it's just moving with the current. I'm jigging, and that jig is just going with me, right? Now, if I have an opposing wind and a force of current and we're going opposite directions, I need to figure out which way should my boat be pointing so the wind's not pushing me sideways or whatever. It's like, does my boat perform better bow into the wind or wind at my stern? I don't really think, and I haven't figured out if those fish care which direction I'm jigging through. For me, it's about vertical line presentation, and I'm going with what the current and the wind allows me to do with my boat. I have a cabin on my boat. It catches more wind than, say, an open sled, right? So I may have to set up differently in the wind to cover a certain line that I want to try to stay on. And I'm staying on top of those fish and keeping my line vertical simply by engaging or disengaging my kicker motor. And the reason I'm fishing as I'm doing that is because I have a much better sense of my line attitude versus having to turn around and look at my buddy's line and try to, oh, okay, you forward or you reverse, and it's all about vertical. You can get a little off slant, but the more vertical you are, the more consistently your jig is performing. And we're simply popping that up and letting it fall, popping it up, letting it fall. It's a really natural flutter darting around, and it really is about boat control, forward and backwards. And once you find fish and you're on a drift and you do a nice long drift and you jig and maybe you pick up a fish or two or don't, you know those fish are there, so you run right back up. And as long as the wind and the current, what the tide's doing, allows you to keep doing that drift over them fish, don't leave those fish to go find fish that you think are going to bite. At some point through that tide, those fish that you are on top of are going to bite. The biggest mistake people do is they're like, these damn things ain't gonna bite. Let's go find some other fish. That old adage, you don't leave fish to find fish. If you are in a situation where you have little wind to fight and the current's conducive and you're jigging straight up and down and you're on top of fish, because trust me, I've been so frustrated, I'm like, these sons of, you know, but you keep going, you keep going, you keep going, eventually somebody starts popping a fish. You just got to stay on top of them and keep getting it in their face, and eventually they're going to feed. I talk about wind. Who here has the Windy app on their phone? You use it a lot for any type of your fishing? Yeah, it's very important for any and all your fishing, if nothing else, for weather reports and safety, right? Because especially out on wide open bodies of water like Puget Sound, the weather can change pretty quick. Now I'm fortunate as of late because I live 8 minutes from the Zittles boat ramp out there in the South Puget Sound. And if I look at the tides and the wind and the forecast, and I'm like, man, I could probably go get 4 hours in. I wanted to fish today. We got a 4-hour window, and then the wind's going to pick up. You know, I might go do that because it's right there at the backyard. So you got to plan your trips accordingly. Are we going to be wasting our time, or do we have a window of whatever works for you, 3, 4, 5 hours, 6 hours on the water through the tide? Can we effectively fish with what the forecast is telling me? Now, you look at this here, the wind forecast, you know, 1-8, 3-5, little gusts there as we go through the day. So 11 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Later in the day, you couple this up with what the tide's doing. So I got to make sure I go back to what my tide's doing. Like, am I going to be in that 4-hour window 2 hours before low slack and 2 hours after? So I'm actually fishing right as the water's coming to a slow. And then as that water picks back up, I know those fish are going to be moving around feeding. So okay, there's my window. So now what's the wind going to do during that window? So I look and I go, over here, look, 1.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.6. Pretty nice, right? The number below that is your wind gusts. So when we get up into here, we got gusts of 9 and 10. Now I'm not saying it's not impossible to do that. You just need to know what your wind's going to do and what you're going to be in for. Sometimes they totally miss it. You get out there and you got, you know, wind blowing sideways at 25 knots and you're like, we're out of here. White caps. You're not jigging in white caps, okay? So I think the two most important things to consider when you're going to go fishing. Well, one, if you have the ability and have the gear, you put the troll rods and the jig rods on the boat. Weather forecasts are not always accurate, so you may find yourself like, we were planning to troll most of the day, but hey man, look what the tide's doing right now, which you should check whatever tide app you use, you know, throughout the day. You can do it even on your Ray Marine if you're set up to do so. And look at what your tide's doing and look at what the weather forecast has changed. Maybe it's like, we got no wind. We need to run over to point XYZ and get on the jig and see if we can find some fish. Okay. A little more work involved at times, but very satisfying when you put it all together. It doesn't happen by chance. You got to plan. Put a little work into it and lay out a plan, right? It's, as my buddy Tommy always says, hope is not a plan. It's like, we're going fishing, I hope we catch fish. Hope is not a plan. Like, put a plan, engage yourself, put a plan, do your homework, and you're probably going to find success. So there's not a lot of, you know, not a huge deep dive on this. I will say, like these little dudes right here, it's little 2-ounce, 2.5-ounce jigs, spinning rod or even a casting rod. We got pinks coming back this year. And when they're lighting up the surface, if you're casting little jigs like this, especially with those soft plastic tails on them, cast them and just let them sink on the pendulum and then just jig them back to the boat. For kids, stuff like that, you're going to light it up. If you want to get into jigging, this is a great season to do that. If you have not done a whole lot of it, because you are going to have a lot of humpies in the water, a lot of coho, and it's a great opportunity to practice your skill, right? And figure it out. And figure out how the jigs work and which rods you like to use and get the kids involved. And then when you really want to dial it in, you start looking for Chinook on the bottom. Can you jig in 100, 120 feet, 150 feet? Yeah, absolutely. Can I get down there with a 3.5-ounce jig? Yeah, it takes a little time. And again, if I got a lot of current and a lot of wind, it's a no-go, okay? But if I have very little wind and a moderate current, 6 and 7 foot tide change, I can probably get to that 120, 140, 150 foot depth if I need to. My option is to first seek out and look for If I'm finding fish held up in structure or little channels underwater in the structure off the islands and things that are in that 40, 50, 60 foot range, it's just easier to jig. You can keep your line vertical longer and you seem to find more fish.